Okay, hopefully not boring you guys too much. Hopefully you're having fun building models. It's up to you how much detail and how perfect you want your models to look. This model is not great, but maybe at a distance connected to under a plane, it would look just fine. However, if you need a close-up shot of it, you might want to add more detail to this. And I know the question you're all asking is, well, what about textures? We will definitely get into textures, and we'll add some detail artificially by putting textures on it. Maybe putting some decals on the bomb, or whatever objects we're using. Texturing is a huge part of adding that detail. So depending on what you're doing, you'll want to add detail with physical modeling or texturing. And we'll get into that in a different video for sure. So here we have this object. But what we really want to do is we want to create a scene, because we're creating a video game, so we need kind of a level. So let's start modeling out a level. I'm going to go back to object mode and move this around here. I'll probably use that somehow in my game. And at this point, maybe you haven't decided what your game's about yet. That's totally okay. What we're doing is learning how to build levels right now. And we can turn our level into a game, and we'll be following the MDA framework to do that. We'll get more into that in another video. So let's go ahead and model some kind of a scene, some kind of an environment. So I'm going to go ahead and start with this one right here. This preset is called a plane. So notice we have this little grid down here. I'm going to scale this up quite a bit, but I'm going to show you kind of a different way to do things. So I'm going to go over here to Attribute Editor. You'll find yourself in this Attribute Editor quite a bit. In fact, this channel box, the modeling toolkit, which we'll go over in another video, and this attribute editor, they're going to be your friends here. So notice I have these different tabs here. Now, Polyplane 1, if I click on this right here, I've got some sliders here I can mess with. And watch what happens. I can change the width and height of my plane here, right? And I can add subdivisions to it if I want, right? Now keep in mind, heavily subdividing things will make it run slower. And depending on how complex you build your scene, you may need to optimize, and that's a key word in game design, optimization, so that you can play it on, let's say, a mobile device or a fast computer or a slow computer or an Xbox 360 or whatever platform you're playing it on. You need to make sure that your game is optimized for that platform so that it can run fast. So you don't want your game to choke out at 12 frames a second, unless that's what you're going for, maybe with like a 2D animation or something. You want your game to be optimized so that it runs fast. And so if I just crank everything up here, I'm going to eventually end up bogging down the machine and slowing it down. So don't add detail. This is a huge Taylor modeling rule. Don't add detail unless you need to. All right? So if you're building a character that's supposed to be realistic, yeah, you're going to add a ton of detail there. But if you're building a tree that's way off in the distance, you don't need to add that much detail. So that's huge. Don't add detail unless you need to. Okay, so now that I've got off my soapbox, you can use these sliders here to really quickly create a grid. I could have there's another way I could have done this. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this. I'll hit plane again, and I'll use the R key to scale it up. But how do I add more subdivisions to it? Okay, so we can actually subdivide this by going to Edit Mesh and then Add Divisions here. I can click this little box, and many of these tools have a little box beside them. Watch what happens when you click that. It creates a dialog. So now we can see how many division levels we want to add. We could just double down, or we could crank it up to 4. Watch what would happen if I cranked it up to 4 and hit Add Divisions. See? Once again, though, I'm adding way too much detail where I don't need it. So I'm going to undo that. Control Z, go back, and we'll do that again. Edit Mesh, Add Divisions. I will go ahead and crank that down to just 1. And so I'll go ahead and apply. It's going to add those divisions. And now we have subdivided this surface. Okay? We could do the same thing to the bomb. See, the bomb has barely any divisions on it. We could go Edit Mesh, Add Divisions here, and see what it did. It doubled the amount of subdivisions on it. Obviously, that looks ugly. So keep in mind that's a cool tool to use. So we need some kind of structures here. We need something to run around, right? So maybe I'll make the level even bigger, scale it up again. Kind of think to myself, maybe this bomb is the size of our character. Maybe it's smaller. Kind of depends on what kind of bomb it is. So I want a fairly big level, so I'll crank this out quite a bit. All right? That should give us enough playroom. We can We can change it at any time we want. So next, let's create some kind of building structure. All right, so what do you think we should start with? How about a cube? All right, we're going to scale that sucker up quite a bit. Move it away from the bomb. Move it up to where it's just touching. Now, I could eyeball this all I want, or I could space go into this view right here, and I could see if I'm right on that line or not. Or this gives me a great opportunity to show you about the channel box and what it could be useful for right here. Okay, so notice this is all the translation, rotation, and scale settings for our object. So when I move this in the X, notice it moves it in the X. If I move it in the Y, it moves it in the Y. And if I translate it in Z, it moves in Z right here. This is kind of important stuff to know. How to change something to get it exactly where you want it. So we know that we want it exactly where this object is, right? We want it sitting right on top of this grid. We don't want it cutting through like that, and we don't want it riding on top. And there's a lot of good reasons for that, besides the fact that it'll make your game look chintzy and dumb, like you didn't know what you were doing when you were modeling. It also can affect things like when we add gravity and rigid body dynamics to our game, where we want to be able to interact with physical objects in the game. If I added rigid body dynamics to this, the house or whatever building this would be would essentially fall right as you started the game, and that would look tacky and goofy. So you do need to know how to set it right where you want it. Now, how do I know where the bottom, where this sits? I know that the origin of this grid right here in the very center is 0, 0, 0 on all of these. And notice when I select the grid, everything's set to 0 because we started it right there in the center. Okay? With this box, it can be a little more difficult because, see, we are set right next to it or right on it, and yet it says translate in the Y is 20. Well, the reason for that is because this center point is at the very center of this cube instead of at the bottom. Okay? Now maybe I'm overcomplicating things for you. I'm going to go to full screen here. Maybe I'm overcomplicating things for you, but this center point, it's important to know how to manipulate it.